Hey guys, it's Andrey, and in this video we're going to start the discussion of the Queen's Gambit accepted. We're going to focus on the lines without knight to f3. After moves d4, d5, c4, black accepts the gambit with d5 takes c4, and here white has a choice. So as I said in this video, we are not going to discuss knight to f3 move, which is considered the main line. We're going to look at other possibilities. Let's start with the is thing. So black has just captured the pawn, so black is a pawn up. What if white tries to regain the pawn directly with the queen to a4 move? So it's not only the attack against the pawn, as you can see, it's also check. So it looks like white is going to win the pawn back. But the problem is black responds with the knight to c6 move, covering the king, developing the knight, and attacking d4 pawn twice. And now, if white tries to defend the pawn with, say, e3 move, which looks very natural, now pawn is definitely defended and c4 is attacked twice, so white is going to capture this pawn next move. Black has a nice possibility. It is e7, e5 move. By the way, it is one of the main reasons why knight to f3 is, well, a bit more flexible than playing anything else at the beginning, because white will control in that case the e5 square. If white doesn't control that square, well, black almost always has this interesting counter-attacking resource. So what's the problem with the e5 here for white? d4 is hanging again, and if, for example, white captures on e5, black has a possibility to develop another piece by playing bishop to d7 move, and there is a threat of just taking on e5 next move. Obviously, white can regain the pawn by taking on c4 here. Let's say queen takes c4, but then knight captures on e5 and black is just fine. So as you may notice, white spent the time on moving the queen only, while black has developed his minor pieces and has good chances to continue with the development. It's not restricted, so knight f6, bishop from f8 goes somewhere, and everything is just okay. So as you can see, queen a4 doesn't quite work. It doesn't give white anything here in this position. So let's get back to the situation after d takes c4 and look at other options. So the next option is to try a4 move. So what is the idea behind this push? Well, in many cases, if you attack c4 pawn, black has a choice between just giving up that pawn or protecting it with a b7, b5. So if black manages to play b5, well, in many cases, he just keeps the extra pawn. So what if white starts with the a4, controlling b5 in advance to simplify the regaining of the c4 pawn? So here we deal with the same problem. The main change of the situation after d5 takes c4 is that the d file is open, and black can use this file for counterattack. Black can exert additional pressure on d4. In this situation, black again has this nice option of playing e5, and white is in trouble because it feels like black simply grabbed the initiative. d4 is under attack. There is a sort of threat of bishop b4 check with the tempo development of the dark squared bishop. If, for example, white doesn't take on e5 and plays something like d5, it weakens c5 square, so black can easily use this square for a nice development of the bishop, exerting some pressure on f2. So this d5 itself may become a target after something like knight f6 or further undermining move like c6. So it's not good. But taking on e5 is also not so great, because in that case, black simply captures the queen. And after this exchange, we may notice that white lost the right to castle. You may argue that, okay, it's an endgame stage already, so what's the problem? Well, not really, because we have only exchanged queens, so it's kind of queenless middle game, and position of the king still matters. So black may continue his development in the very simple way, just attacking e5, then light squared bishop is being developed somewhere to e6 or f5, black castles along with the tempo, attacking the king, and simply starts the attack. So this also looks just awful for white. That's why white usually focuses on e3 or e4 move after d5 takes c4. So let's get back to that position and try to understand what happens within that line. So the first option, which is very natural, it is e2 to e4. We have discussed already that it is one of the main ideas behind the Gambit. So to get the control over e4 square, so why not to occupy the central square with the pawn right now? Moreover, it is the move which attacks c4, because now bishop can take this pawn next move, right? So here, black has several options. Again, the normal flow here is to focus on undermining the d4. But first, let's try to understand what happens if black goes greedy. For example, b7, b5 looks very natural, just to protect pawn c4. So it feels like a very solid defense, because even if b5 is undermined, for example, black has different options to protect it, like c6 or a6. But it's not quite the case here. White indeed continues with the a4 move, undermining b5. Now it's henning. It's clear that if black doesn't protect the pawn with the pawn, white will just capture it, and then c4 will become a simple target and will drop in one or two moves. So black has to react somehow. There are different options here. One of the possibilities to protect the pawn is c6. You should know that a6 doesn't work here because of a takes b5, so it's not really a defense. As you may notice, the rook is henning, so black cannot recapture. That's why the only chance to protect the pawn with the pawn is to play c6 here. And now white has a possibility of taking on b5. After c takes b5, black has an advantage on the queen side. So if we ignore everything up to d file and focus on the c, b, and a files, we may notice that black has 3 pawns against 1. It would be a nice advantage in the endgame stage, but the problem is we have just started the game. So these pawns are quite vulnerable, and white has a possibility to attack b5. There are different options. So one of the typical methods of attacking these pawns is just to undermine it with b3. But in this particular case, white also has very interesting knight to c3 move, which is a development with the tempo, attacking the pawn. If black plays something like a6, white again can exploit the motive of the henning rook on a8, just taking on b5 with the knight. If pawn moves here, which looks interesting, attacking the knight, it's also possible just to go away with the knight, and this pawn on c4 will be extremely vulnerable. I guess there are different options. For example, knight to d5 looks interesting, or simple knight to a4, anything literally. Queen to a4, check may be considered as well, just taking the pawn then. So it doesn't quite work, and if black protects the pawn with the bishop to d7 move, which is a developing move and looks like a solid defense, then white may play d5, and in this case, white gets a long-term compensation for a pawn. So it's a true gambit here. Black is a pawn up, but pay attention to the problem with the development. After this d4, d5, it's really unclear how black is going to complete the development of the queen side. So c6 square is controlled, so this knight on b8 has no moves at the moment. White has different options of completing the development, so knight easily goes to f3. Let's say this bishop may be developed to f4 or maybe g5. Light squared bishop may be simply developed to e2. At some point, white may think of just undermining the pawn c4 with the b3. And also, don't forget about central pawns. So here white got exactly what he wanted, because now white has very powerful pawn center, well supported by pieces from behind. And at some point, it may end up with something like e5 and maybe even e6. So this doesn't look good for black. So greedy approach doesn't work. That's what I mean. It's not always the case, but in the most of cases, it's better to focus on undermining the d4 pawn rather than saving the pawn on c4. So after e4, black has different options of attacking the d4 pawn. Let's start with the c5 move. So c7, c5 looks good. The same idea like behind e7, e5. So if white captures the pawn, there is an exchange of queens, bringing white's king to bad position and then starting the attack. But here white has different options how to react to that, so it doesn't really cause a serious problem. Main problem with the c5 is that it is only the attack against d4. It doesn't serve any other goal. So white can react with, let's say, d4, d5 move, grabbing the space, and c4 is still henning, as you may notice. And again, white is getting very strong center. Let's say black continues with the same strategy, just undermining central pawns after e6. White protects it with the knight to c3. Black continues his development, also attacking d5 pawn. And in this case, white plays knight to f3, continuing the development and simply ignoring ed5, because after e takes d5, instead of just taking on d5, which is also possible and may be considered, white has a better option. It is e5. So a tempo move, attacking the knight, and once the knight goes away, d5 drops. So for example, after knight f to d7, something like bishop to g5, bishop to e7, bishop captures on e7, queen takes on e7, and white captures on d5, it's clear that white is getting very powerful position because the knight is centralized. It's a tempo move. Queen has to go away somewhere, probably to d8 to cover c7, and then white just regains the pawn with bishop takes c4, and everything is just amazing for white. Look at the development, look at this pawn on e5, castle is ready, black is underdeveloped, and probably failed to deal with white's center, so white got exactly what he wanted. Another option for white after black's c5 move is simply to protect it with a piece. So let's get back to it. It is knight to f3 move. So pawn on d4 is protected. And after, let's say, c takes d4, white may simply capture on d4 with the queen. That's an interesting option as well. So it feels like a simplification. And yes, it is a simplification. So white is not against exchanging queens here because compared to previous lines that we have already discussed, there is nothing wrong happening to the king. And white gets very simple development here. For example, after queen takes d4 and knight takes d4, c4 is hanging, and it's not black's only problem. So there is also an option of bringing the knight to b5 with the idea of knight c7 that black has to take into account. So normally black responds with the bishop to d7 here to cover b5 square. Now comes bishop takes c4, and as you may notice, white has a slight advantage here. Because of the better development at the moment, white controls more squares here. Potentially, white has an advantage in space. In general, this type of positions is quite annoying for black to play because it looks like, almost equal position, but it's never quite equal. That's the problem. So after c5, as you may notice, white has a good choice between playing d5 and simply protecting the pawn with the knight. So c5 is not really satisfactory thing for black. Let's get to other possibilities. What if black tries to counterattack d4 combined with the development of the minor piece? Let's say knight goes to c6 here. Well, it looks not so bad, actually. Moreover, after white's natural reply d5, black can exploit this idea. Knight goes to e5. It looks strange a bit, but we should understand that if white continues with the attack against the knight, black has a nice option of bringing the knight to d3 with check, forcing the exchange of the light square bishop to the knight, and then material will be balanced, but black will have pair of bishops. That is the basic idea behind knight to c6. The problem, though, is that white can actually respond with the knight to f3, first defending the d4 pawn and also controlling e5. The natural response for black here, because as you may notice, black started the fight for d5, for d4 and e5 squares here, is bishop to g4, pinning the knight, and again attacking the pawn on d4. So now white responds with the d5 finally, and after knight to e5 may play bishop to f4. So what's the difference? If black plays knight to d3 here, it may quickly lead to the problem with the b7, I think, because bishop on g4 is a bit misplaced. So if knight d3, we just take several times, and there is a threat of queen to b5 already, as well as knight to e5 and so on. So black may try something like knight to g6, where after bishop also goes back to e3. And, well, it doesn't feel like black achieved what he wanted. So basically, the idea was to win the fight for d4 and e5 squares, but here white controls these squares perfectly. This bishop on g4 is a bit misplaced. It may become a target very soon. So black may try something like e7, e5 here, putting the pawn on the central square. White will obviously ignore this move because, there is an option of taking Untitled, but it leaves white without a powerful pawn on d5, so the natural move will be something like bishop takes c4. Now, as you can see, since the bishop is already on g4, there are some problems with b7 potentially, so white may consider something like queen to b3 move. There is also something like bishop b5 possible, and after something like a6, well, actually dealing with the bishop b5 threat and being ready to play b7, b5 probably against queen to b3, white may clarify the things with the light squared bishop by playing h3 here. So if black captures on f3, white simply has pair of bishops, which is good. If bishop goes away, nothing really changes, so white has a slight advantage here because of this central pawns e4 and d5. This advanced pawn guarantees the advantage in space, controlling c6 and e6 squares, and white simply has nice possibilities to exert some pressure on c7 potentially. Black is quite passive here, so I would not recommend to play this line. Let's get back to the situation after e4 and see what black has there, in addition to what we have already discussed. So now we're getting to two major continuations, two most important moves against e4. The one is knight to f6, developing the knight and counter-attacking central pawn e4. So white's most natural reply here is e4, e5, attacking the knight. So the main idea is not to lose time on anything else, but to play in a very aggressive and ambitious way. Moreover, this e5 is a guarantee of the attack on the king side later on. The problem with the e5, though, is that d5 square is vulnerable now, and black may use it as a nice spot for the knight, or just a good blockading square for any other piece. So knight goes to the center, knight goes to d5, white obviously captures on c4. Now the bishop exerts some pressure on f7, and black has to be very careful here. So the problem for black is that white has a bit more space, so it's not so obvious how to place the pieces in the right way so that every piece gets more or less active position. Obviously, black doesn't want to play something like e6 because bishop becomes quite passive here. So what black wants to do here is to develop the bishop somewhere, maybe to f5 or g4 prior to playing this e6 move. But as I said, black has to be very careful because f7 is always under pressure. So one of the possibilities for black here is just to play knight to b6, attacking the bishop, and again opening the d file, so now there is a pressure against d4. Another thing that happened after white played e4, e5, that d4 became a backward pawn. So it may be considered a weakness, and it should be the most natural target for black. That's why knight b6 tempo move, also opening the queen with the attack against d4. So then black may combine the development with attacking this d4. It's the most annoying thing for white here, obviously. So bishop goes to b3. Let's focus on this move. There are different options, but bishop b3 is the most logical one because white developed this bishop to attack f7. Now black may continue with knight to c6 or bishop to f5. Both moves are possible. Let's start with the knight to c6 move. Now white protects d4 pawn with the knight to f3 move. And the most natural continuation of black's strategy would be bishop to g4 move, pinning the knight and hence exerting additional pressure on d4. In many cases, just threatening to take that pawn in one or two moves. But as usual for such a situation, when you develop the bishop on g4 and you have not well protected f7 pawn, you have to be extremely careful, especially if the bishop is already developed. So white has two interesting options here. If white doesn't want to play at all, it's possible to play knight to g5. Sacrificing the queen, but it's not really a sacrifice because after bishop takes d1, the game ends quickly. After bishop takes f7, king goes to d7, and then bishop to e6, check, followed by the perpetual. Yes, it ends quickly, but ends with a draw. So if white is more ambitious and wants to keep on playing, then after bishop to g4 move, there is an option of taking on f7 first. So bishop is not protected, which means after king takes f7, knight to g5, check, white will capture the bishop next move. So king has to go back to a safe place. Now bishop is being captured. And, well, just imagine d4 is not hanging, white will have probably decisive advantage. Here it's not the case because black still has a chance to take on d4 with the queen, trying to simplify the things because, well, the king has already moved, which means there is no right to castle. So black is trying to exchange queens and get to the endgame. But white may ignore this queen d4 move, simply going back with the queen to e2. In this case, black obviously can capture the pawn on e5, but then bishop goes to e3. Yes, white is a pawn down here, but the compensation is obvious. First of all, it is the king, which will stay in the center, and also the pawn structure. Pay attention that after losing f7 pawn, black got so many weaknesses on light squares, especially f7, e6, and white may use it as well. So it's a complicated position, but I think it's a good one for white if he wants to fight for initiative. Black may avoid all these complications by developing the bishop on f5 a bit earlier. So instead of playing knight to c6 move, it's possible to develop the bishop on f5 immediately. So exactly in this position, black moves the bishop to f5, and it's very solid because black wants to play e6 next move, solving the problem of the a2 g8 diagonal, solving the problem with the f7, which is always under pressure. Here, white develops the knight to c3, black plays e6, protecting the bishop, and actually preparing the next portion of attack against d4. So now, since d5 is controlled a bit better, black can play knight c6 easily. Next move. White has two different options here. So the one is to develop the knight on e2, another one is to develop the knight on f3. In both cases, position is quite complicated, but I think that development of the knight to e2 is a bit more flexible because white avoids all potential problems with bishop g4 later on. Black develops the knight to c6, white usually castles, and black plays queen to d7. So as you can see, it's very important to control d5, to overprotect this square. For this reason, black plays queen to d7 to prepare rook to d8. But not only rook to d8, black actually continues with the long castling here, bringing the rook to d8, and also bring the king to a safe place, more or less, because it's not so simple for white to organize the attack on the queen side here, although it's not impossible. So black has to be very careful. I think this position is pretty complicated, and of course you need deeper knowledge and better preparation to play it with both colors. Now let's get to the other continuation, which is possible after white's e4. It is e5 move, which undermines the pawn immediately. So right after white's e4, black plays e7, e5. Everything is according to the strategy. So we have opened the d file, and now since white doesn't control e5, we try to use it to undermine the d4. As I said earlier, c5 was also meant to undermine d4, but it didn't serve any other goal. So what is different about e7, e5? As you can see, we also prepare the development of the dark squared bishop, and this is obviously much better than c7, c5. For instance, if white reacts with the d4, d5, we may use c5 square with our bishop. So we can develop it on the active position, already exerting some pressure on f2. So normally, white responds with an interesting knight to f3 move, playing a real gambit. So white is going to sacrifice a pawn for faster development and some initiative against black's vulnerable spots like b7, f7, and so on. e5 is under attack, so black cannot justify losing that pawn, so e takes d4 is more or less forced here, in which case white is not going to recapture in d4 and simply takes the c4 pawn. Why? Because, well, first of all, it is a development move. White brings another piece to the game, attacks f7, and d4 is not necessarily that healthy, so in several moves, white will have a chance to regain it. For example, here, black may defend the pawn with knight to c6 move, where after white continues with castling. So as you may notice, black is underdeveloped a bit, and this may cause a problem. In this position, black can develop the light squared bishop, just to try to solve the problem with f7, because white is literally ready for any sort of attack against this one. So queen to b3 may be considered, knight to g5 may be considered, and so on. So bishop e6 looks pretty natural in this situation. So black is not against bishop takes e6 line, because in that case, although we may notice some weakening of the pawn structure, black is able to protect most critical vulnerable pawns and squares. So for example, queen to b3 attacking e6 and b7 simultaneously. Black protects the e6 because it's more important. Then queen can capture on b7, but black wins some tempo because of it. So rook goes to b8, queen, let's say, goes to a6. It's just the only square to occupy. And here black continues with the development. So as we may notice here, since white lost some time to move his queen around the board, black got some time for development of other pieces. So black is doing fine here in this situation. That's why after bishop to e6, white may use another interesting weapon. So it is bishop to b5 move. So bishop goes to b5 here, pinning the knight, which protects d4. And white is trying to damage the pawn structure, and it's almost inevitable here. So when black tries to protect the pawn, because white's threat was just to take on d4, white doesn't have to take on c6 first to win that pawn back. So bishop goes to c5 to protect it. Now it's already possible to exert additional pressure on knight c6, but white has even better option. It is b4, attacking the bishop. Very interesting situation. Appears that black cannot really take on b4, because in that case, white plays queen to a4, attacking both c6 and bishop on b4. And it's getting really ugly for black, because it's not actually only the attack against this 2, it's also a potential attack against d4. So the problem, bishop cannot go to c5, because after that, white can capture on c6 twice, attacking the king and the bishop on c5, which means black inevitably runs into a big trouble after knight takes d4 next move. So bishop takes b4 is impossible, which means black is more or less forced to go back to b6 to keep pawn d4 protected. White continues with a very natural a4 move, creating a threat of a5 trapping the bishop. Now black may try a6, where after white captures on c6, and after b takes c6, gets very simple play against black's weaknesses. So the next move is a5, fixing the pawn structure, moving the bishop to a7. Then bishop goes to b2, attacking d4, and literally regaining it already. So black's only natural possibility here is to counterattack with knight to f6, and white may try to ignore this knight e4. For example, bishop takes d4 looks very promising, although in this case, almost inevitably we get the ending with the extra pawn for black, but the quality of the pawns is not very good. Let's say knight takes e4, bishop takes a7, rook takes a7. There is an exchange of queens possible, bringing the king to not very good position. Probably because of it, it's better to start with queen takes d1, but it doesn't really improve black's position, because the main issue is, of course, this pawn. So after rook takes a7, knight goes to d4, starting the direct attack against black's weaknesses. Bishop goes to d5, then f3 kicks the knight away from the central position. Knight goes to d6, and then knight goes to c3. So yes, black is a pawn up, but the bishop is rather useless because it doesn't attack anything significant in this position, and these pawns are quite vulnerable. So this line is not necessarily the only possible within the e4, e5 direction, but it's pretty much what you may expect from this direction. So if you play it as black, I would recommend knight f6, but of course, it's your own decision. Let's get back to the situation after d5 takes c4 to look at another major direction, e3 move. So here white has another option to attack c4 and build a strong center. It is e3. So it looks very modest, and it is. So white is not fighting for e4. But, well, the idea is almost the same. So white wants to take the pawn on c4 and then base everything on a better presence in the center, because after all, white is going to have at least one extra central pawn compared to black. So we have discussed this already. b5 is not good here because of white's a4 move, and after c6, a takes b5, and c takes b5. White is winning the material after queen to f3, so it's impossible to protect the rook here. That's why black should base his play here on undermining white's d4 pawn, and it is possible with the help of c5 and e5 moves. We're going to focus on e5 because c5 immediately or after some preparation is going to give us the same position like after knight to f3 line, which we're going to cover in later video. So let's focus on e75. Why not to undermine the d4 since white has a problem with the d file right now. The same thing, so white cannot really take on e5 because the exchange of queens brings white's king to a bad position, and black may continue with a simple development and attack against it. So normally white just ignores it and takes the pawn on c4, allowing black to take on d4. And this leads to one of the most important patterns in Queen's Gambit Accepted, position with the isolated pawn on d4. But compared to other lines here, the pawn is on the c file, not on the e file. It makes some differences, so in this case, white has better options to deliver the attack in the center and on the king side, so black has to be extremely careful. Moreover, this bishop is much more active compared to positions with the pawn on the e file, because when black has pawn on e6, it's much harder to get to f7. Here it's not the case. So after bishop takes c4, black continues with the normal development. It is knight to f6. White does exactly the same. Knight goes to f3, preparing castling, and already highlighting the weakness of the e5 square. So this is the main square for the knight in this position. Black continues with the bishop to d6 move, developing the bishop, preparing castling, and also controlling d6. White castles, black castles, and white continues with the knight to c3. So this position looks simple, but it's not. Black's main problem here is what to do with the light square bishop, because it's not clear where to put it. Almost everywhere it is quite vulnerable. The first impression is that it will be quite okay on g4. So let's say bishop goes to g4, but it appears that white has a simple way of attacking this bishop immediately. So pawn goes to h3. Obviously, black doesn't want to give white pair of bishops here and tries to save the bishop, moving the bishop to h5. But then white continues with a straightforward g4, and after bishop goes to g6, knight jumps to e5. And here comes the understanding of why the pawn on the c file is not so good compared to the pawn on the e file. Just imagine a similar position with the pawn on e6. It would be much harder for white to play something like f4, f5. Here it's not the case. As you can see, f5 is not controlled. So in addition to all the activity that white usually has because of the knight on e5, white has this f4, f5 threat, which is quite annoying. That's why bishop g4 is not so cool. Black also has to take into account that white is going to develop his bishop on g5. One of the possibilities here is to put the knight on c6. In this case, e5 is controlled much better, so knight e5 is prevented at least for now. d4 is under additional pressure. But here white just plays h3 move, preventing black's bishop to g4. And now the only square which is left for the bishop is f5, but it's also not necessarily that great because the bishop may become a target quite easily after something like knight to h4. So it's not a very pleasant position for black. At the same time, bishop g5 is threatening pinning the knight, and it will be not so simple for black to get rid of that pin, only by moving the bishop back to e7, but it's passive. That's why probably the most natural move here is h6, preventing that. White has time to prevent black's bishop f5 now. So queen goes to c2. Very interesting possibility. So it's a prophylactic move. Controlling f5 square, so that's leaving black's light square bishop on the e6 square, but e6 is not necessarily that good. So black may try something like knight to b4, queen goes to b1, still controlling f5. Next, bishop goes to e6, because where to put this bishop is unclear. e6 looks more or less okay, but the problem is that after the exchange of bishops and f takes e6, we may notice that the potential weakness of isolated d4 pawn is now compensated with the weakness of the e6, because e6 is also isolated now. This position is more or less balanced. So after rook e1, queen to d7, let's say something like a3 or maybe bishop to d2, white has, well, a slight advantage, I guess, because it feels like black has a bit more weaknesses than white. White's only problem, and it's even a potential problem, so it's not a problem right now, is d4. But things like g6 square, e6 pawn may become a problem rather quickly. So, well, you decide if you want to play something like this as black, and I would recommend to try it as white for sure. So, in this video, we have discussed different possibilities for white in Queen's Gambit accepted, except for knight to f3 move, which is something that we're going to cover next time. And I will quickly remind you what is the main problem with not controlling e5 square, exactly the thing that knight to f3 does. So after accepting the gambit, black opens the d file, which means that it's possible to counterattack along the d file, exerting some pressure on d4. And one of these possibilities is e7, e5. And as you can see, it may work in almost any situation. So knight to f3, the move that we're going to cover in the next video, is fighting exactly this idea. So it prevents e5 for now. So the only real possibility to counterattack d4 will be something like c7, c5. But we know already that it's probably not optimal. Anyway, this position is not bad for black, and why it's not, we're going to cover in the next video. So let's do it.